Welcome to the end. Not the apocalypse, not the end of history, but the end of philosophy. We have thus far covered the history of philosophy in three stages: the rise of reason with the Greeks, the creation of the self with Christianity, and the rise of practical science in the modern period, which we know as the Enlightenment. We are now entering the fourth and final stage of philosophy: nihilism and postmodernism. The triumph of practical science, which is what occurred in modern philosophy, marked the end of intellectual contemplation. Reason is no longer concerned with understanding ourselves through the observation of nature, as it was for the Greeks, or the discovery of inner nature and the human heart, as it was for the Christians. Reason is concerned with simply the most efficient ways to obtain what the body needs to live and thrive. This is modern rationalism, which eventually gives way to a materialist understanding of everything, materialist determinism, which leads to the birth of utilitarianism, the philosophy that believes all questions can be solved by the answers of practical benefits to the human body. Even though some modern philosophers, like the German idealists, rejected this hollow vision of the cosmos and humanity, practical science triumphed. Even in Marx, practical science is the normative governing understanding of the world, hence scientific socialism, and why socialism must inevitably triumph. It is materially predetermined, just like how all science is materially predetermined, per the discoveries of Isaac Newton. However, Marx also gave room for the rediscovery of thought within this materialist prison. Why, if all human action is based on predetermined pragmatic materialism, is there inequality between people? This question, the only question that is permitted in the Marxist framework, the question of inequality, allows and allowed for the last hurrah of philosophy. This is why the question of inequality is now the final and only question of postmodern philosophy. Because the world of materialist causality ultimately has no meaning, nihilism, the sort of father of postmodernism, emerged in the mid and late 19th century, beginning with Max Stirner and Friedrich Nietzsche. Nihilism, however, is much more than the philosophy of nothingness, or the belief that there is no inherent meaning to life and the cosmos. Yes, this is true in a crude sense, but this doesn't accurately reflect nihilism as philosophy. For if you just accept that there is no meaning to life, this fails to explain why people live by meaning in their lives. According to Nietzsche, that's because people create their meaning to live by. We cannot live in a meaningless world. We therefore, even though we live in a meaningless world, create the values by which we live by. This becomes the basis of existentialism, the self-creating self in a world of nothingness, as Jean-Paul Sartre would explain in Being and Nothingness. The nihilists, then, articulated a philosophy of constant creation and struggle against the emptiness of life. To live is to struggle, to create, where there is nothing to ultimately accept or grow into. Nihilism rejects the teleological understanding of nature offered by the Greeks. Nihilism also rejects the idea of an inner reality and belief in God as truth and love offered by Christianity. Instead, nihilism posits that all reality is self-constructed. You may know this term through another word, or two words specifically: social construction. Social construction, or social constructionism, does not mean something is not real. This bears repeating. Social construction does not mean something is not real. It just means something is not determined by nature. All values are socially constructed, and socially constructed values exist precisely because people live by them, and these socially constructed values help to create laws and institutions. These laws and institutions that are socially constructed by the values that people created for themselves are, therefore, unnatural in the sense that they cannot be found in nature, but they exist because all existence is socially constructed. Those who would attempt to explain laws and institutions as reflecting or defending laws of nature or natural rights are guilty of the naturalistic fallacy. There is no fixed nature. This, as you would recall, is the discovery of modern philosophy. All things are fluid and malleable. Values change because new values are created by people who lack power and influence in the world of human action. And once you come to the understanding that laws of nature and natural rights and a constitution and the rule of law are simply socially constructed, you can ignore the rule of law, constitutionalism, laws of nature, and natural rights. And this is how nihilism became a revolutionary philosophy. The understanding that everything is created by people becomes the foundation for what we call postmodernism in philosophy. The essence of postmodernism is that there are no essences. Essence does not precede existence. Existence precedes essence. Even though the world is causally determined by materialist forces for practical bodily desires, this postmodernism does share with modern philosophy, the fact that humans create values and laws and institutions to benefit themselves over others is what explains that question of inequality that Marx observed. Why are there inequalities? People created and took for themselves to empower themselves at the expense of others. It's a rather simple explanation. These inequalities then become embodied in the world of human creation, the world of social construction. Because humans are not the same as nature, again, another inheritance from modern philosophy, and because humans create their own world, something postmodernism also shares with the modern philosophical idea of creating the empire of man and the relief of man's estate, the task of philosophy is aimed at the deconstruction of these inequalities that exist in the socially constructed world. Postmodern philosophy is principally a philosophy of critique, of deconstruction. That famous phrase you have now heard again and again in the 21st century by everyone from political activists and journalists to philosophers and even scientists. Postmodernism, then, far from a rejection of modern philosophy, and again, this bears repeating because many people say postmodernism is a rejection of modern philosophy. Postmodernism is not a rejection of modern philosophy. It is actually a continuation of the modern project with just a recognition of the pragmatism of the Enlightenment as a farce. That is the only significant difference between postmodernism and the so-called modern philosophies of the Enlightenment. Postmodernism attempts to return to the questions and skepticism of philosophy, which has always been part of the philosophical tradition, by casting scorn and deconstruction on that most famous Enlightenment idea, the idea of progress. In postmodernism's rejection of the story of practical progress, postmodernism casts doubt on whether or not we have actually been progressing through the rise of science, technology, and economics. Postmodernism, which shares all the foundations of modern philosophy, a belief in the self-creation of nature, the malleability of nature, a belief in the materialist reality of life, starts as a deconstruction of whether or not this modern project is achieving what it claims to achieve. At its root, though, postmodernism shares with Marxism the principal concern for an oppressor-oppressed dialectic. With nihilism, postmodernism also shares the assumption that all values and realities are socially constructed. This is how we get down to what we said earlier. Postmodernism rejects the idea of essences. But again, this is really just an formal elaboration of what modern philosophy was already hinting at. If there is no fixed nature, there can be no essences. Whereas the Greeks asserted essence precedes existence, a view that would have been shared by Christianity, postmodern philosophy turns this paradigm on its head. As we've said before, existence precedes essence, and all forms of essentialism are social constructions, and are, therefore, manifestations of bad faith, to use the famous term by Sartre. The problem with postmodernism is that even though it attempts to carve out space for a return to questioning that was jettisoned by the practical materialism of Enlightenment philosophy, it is, in fact, very narrow-minded and dogmatic in that the schools of philosophy that would assert essence before existence, objectivity before subjectivity, truth before relativity, are bad faith questions or beliefs to hold and cannot, therefore, be tolerated. Postmodernism has no use for that one great value of the Enlightenment, toleration. So postmodernism ends up imposing its monopoly over the realm of what is acceptable questions. One must accept the postmodern credo. Thus, the reopening of the Western philosophical mind after its closure by the pragmatism of the Enlightenment also brought about its second closure with postmodernism. The answers to philosophy have all been answered. All things are socially constructed, and all social constructions that have thus far existed in history, itself a social construct, have resulted in some sort of oppressor-oppressed dialectic. Any deviation from this narrative is considered anathema, and the true intellectual, the true philosopher, is simply the one who is investigating and deconstructing the oppressor-oppressed dialectic. That is the only thing that matters in life. What, then, can we summarize through this history of philosophy? Philosophy actually begins with poetry. Greek poetry asserted the cosmos was one of chaos and violence, and that human nature was a mere image of that chaos and violence. Philosophy, the birth of reason, challenged this view. The cosmos was rationally ordered, and humans, possessing a soul, which is the rational part of the mind, can conform to the nature of the cosmos. Greek philosophy and Greek reason is outwardly focused on the imitation of nature, the most famous argument of Aristotle, and also shared by many of the later Stoics. The unity of human nature with the natural world was the product of Greek philosophy. The next stage in the revolution of Western philosophy was the birth of the self, which began with Christianity. Christianity inherited many of the Greek philosophical assumptions, which is why, in particular, Catholic philosophy has such a great appreciation for Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics. But this isn't the great contribution of Christian philosophy, the preservation of the Greeks. The great revolution of Christian philosophy is its concern for love, love of self, love of neighbor, love of the world, love of God, and how this question of love begins the philosophy of the self and the subject. Christian philosophy therefore begins the inward turn to the self and the rise of subjectivity, whereas Greek philosophy looked outward to the observation and imitation of nature for the answers and the questions of human nature, Christianity turned inward for the answers and questions of human nature by probing the depth of the human psyche and the human heart, and the end result of Christian philosophy was the invention of the self. Greek and Christian philosophy are, therefore, concerned, as we've noted, with the questions of human nature. Modern philosophy, beginning with the Enlightenment, is no longer concerned with the questions of human nature, but with human power. Reason is no longer to be employed to understand the self in relation to the cosmos, or the self in relation to the ideas of love or God. Reason is simply the practical thought process of material beings, material bodies, attempting to acquire the material goods necessary for life. The Enlightenment marks the ascendancy of pragmatic philosophy, with its belief in materialist determinism, as humans are simply manifestations of the same physics that govern the universe. Matter in motion. The Enlightenment philosophy isn't about reason and what the abracadabra magicians like Steven Pinker assert. The Enlightenment understanding of reason isn't about intellectual contemplation. It is about the scientific, industrial, and economic conquest and transformation of the world to improve the material conditions of human life, thus the birth of utilitarianism and eventually capitalism. Philosophy in the Enlightenment tradition is now concerned with just the materialist conditions of life instead of the questions of human nature, metaphysics, and ontology that preoccupied the Greeks and Christians. This emergence, however, was not satisfactory to all. The Romantics and German idealists, especially, rebelled against this materialization of life and the sterile understanding of the cosmos. They realized that, if true, there could be no morality and no freedom, since freedom and morality is found in moral choice. Kant, then, inaugurates the reaction to Enlightenment determinism, materialism, and practical reason, hence a couple of his famous book titles, The Critique of Pure Reason and The Critique of Practical Reason. The German idealists revive the concern of the self from Christianity and the concern for nature from the Greeks, and fuse these earlier philosophical beliefs with the new discoveries of modernity, and give rise to the philosophies of consciousness that we find in Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. The German idealist project, however, collapsed under the weight of practical materialism. The German materialists replaced the idealists, who asserted that consciousness is not the byproduct of the self or nature, as proclaimed by Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, but by the determinative materialist forces that govern the universe. The most famous of these philosophers was Karl Marx. Eventually, modern philosophy concluded with the rise of nihilism, the belief that all values and all beliefs were socially constructed by the struggle against the meaninglessness of the cosmos. At long last, we arrive now at postmodernism, as we've just covered, which took over the German materialist and nihilist traditions of philosophy. The world is socially constructed, which has produced the oppressor-oppressed classes we witness today. Postmodernism is concerned with the practical material conditions of existence, just like modern philosophy is. But postmodernism is doubtful over the narrative of progress, the idea of progress offered by the Enlightenment. Instead of becoming freer, more prosperous, postmodernism eventually comes to have the belief that we are becoming enslaved and poorer. Those who disagree are wrong and cannot be tolerated. However, with more and more people returning to the questions of first principles, metaphysics, the self, and human nature, the questions of philosophy are re-emerging in the 21st century. The end of philosophy that we are witnessing today is also, paradoxically, becoming the rebirth of philosophy before our very eyes. Those who have been indoctrinated in the modern and postmodern mindset, however, are terrified of the prospects of everything that they've been told to believe having been lies. But this is what philosophy is in its purest form, a questioning of the inherited beliefs that came before us. Some of us may agree with those beliefs, others may be skeptical of them, others more may find great wisdom in those ancient beliefs while adding new wisdom from the more recent past. But so long as some agree and others do not, the dialectic of philosophy remains, and therefore philosophy itself remains. Philosophy, to put it simply, concerns itself with the questions of the human condition, who we are, and the world we inhabit. And while answers have always been given, the fact that we still have questions proves the invaluable reality of philosophy, the open mind to which we are all called to consider.